Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to give it about 3 minutes just to let more folks join in on the room. So just feel free to hang out and we'll get started shortly. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes as we let the room fill a little. So just feel free to hang out and we'll get started shortly. Thank you. Great. We're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. Hope you all can hear and see me. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager here at TechEquity Collaborative. And in my role, I get to engage with folks through some of our events, volunteer opportunities, organizing opportunities, and now I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in any questions into the Q&A as we go, but we won't answer those until the end. And I do want to mention up top that the webinar will be recorded. So we'll send out a follow-up email afterwards with all the links, a copy of the presentation slides, and a copy of the recording. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. Today we'll cover a little bit about why TechEquity exists as an organization and how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to address our most pressing economic issues. So we'll start first with why we're here. Well, TechEquity got started because some of its founders and early members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods. And they understood that there was this perception out there that tech and tech workers were the cause of the problem. So they noticed things such as rising rents, displacement, traffic, and people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns and that they, as tech workers, were uniquely positioned to help contribute to solutions that would address some of these problems and challenges within their communities. And especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis that's all around us is getting so much worse, with an increased burden on lower income people and communities of color. Many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. But at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. So as a result, the pandemic has the potential to even further exacerbate some of the inequalities that we've already seen in our region. So because of this affordability crisis, communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, growing up in the Bay Area my whole life, I've kind of been able to see both sides of the coin. I have friends and family who are concerned and worried about the changes their communities are facing and what that means for them. But I also have friends and family who have pursued jobs within the tech industry and have found lots of success, and they're really enjoying it. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame, it starts to create an us versus them dynamic that's further dividing our communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide. So while we're all unsure as to how we'll be managing this new normal caused by the pandemic, it's important to it's important to note that the tech sector has remained relatively unscathed, as I mentioned before. More than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors. But it can be hard to know how to best engage in a time of such uncertainty. So this is the state of our affordability crisis in the Bay Area. And I think the fact that rents are rising isn't really a surprise to anyone on this call because we already know, we feel this, we've heard this, right? And while some Californians are very successful in the tech driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants and renters have actually decreased slightly throughout the years. And we're showing stats for California because that's where we're based and it's where tech is headquartered. But a version of the story is playing out all across the country. And it's really a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success. And without tech at the table to work together to address our shared crisis, it's understandable that communities are frustrated, like we just talked about. So before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering just around 4%, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims spiked to 16%, which is a more dramatic spike than our last recession. So, in the span of 1 month last year, we lost a decade's worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. So, at Tech Equity, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it won't happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities, and we have to show up. And we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. We believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to the issues they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. And we know we can do this, and the first step is to show up. I know I've done a great first step today by signing on, joining this webinar, joining the discussion, and getting to learn a little bit more about our affordability crisis and how you can possibly engage. So our goal at Tech Equity is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. We believe effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. And we help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in the system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live in through book clubs that we host with authors, panel discussions with experts in the field, webinars such as these, and voter guides that we produce around election season. And we advocate for public policy that rebalances power and builds economic equity. So, a perfect example of that is our work in coalition with a couple other Bay Area nonprofits, legislators, stakeholders, and people in the community that helped pass the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which now extends protections to 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gougings of rent. And another example of public policy is this year with the rental registry, which I'll be talking about a little bit later in the presentation. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in the broader community through our corporate partnerships and engagements with companies. So tech workers have outsized political power that is largely untapped when it comes to public policy advocacy. So connecting tech workers to outside perspectives builds more empathy and ethical practice in our workplaces, in our products, and in our surrounding communities. At Tech Equity, our two issue areas that we focus in on are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are really a core part of this, the issues really are intertwined and intersect in many ways because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agendas to these new realities. So while the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity in our neighborhoods. The affordability crisis is decades in the making. The policy choices we've made over the course of decades have set us up for this new level of pain our community is feeling, especially now during the pandemic. So, in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color, in the Bay Area, in California, and all across the country. And that policy is redlining. So, redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And so the policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined, as we can see with the image of the screen, which is a redlined map of San Francisco here in the Bay Area. And those communities that were redlined were deemed risky for investment and therefore didn't receive any investment. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color. That really isn't by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. So, in other words, redlining was a discriminatory policy and a racist policy. It made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or for maintaining their homes, like for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. And there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. So the crisis we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. Like I said, it extends all throughout California and all throughout the country. So as you can see on the screen, these are two red line maps of Atlanta and Austin, both cities that are starting to be more of a tech hub, kind of like San Francisco. As you can see, they both have histories of redlined and segregated neighborhoods. So, by preventing entire neighborhoods from being able to access this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who have lived in red line neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. So, an income shock can be anything like a huge rent increase, a sudden loss of a job, or something like your car breaking down and it's super expensive. And it impacts almost 1 out of 2 Californians. So 46% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates. So 67% of Latino households are in liquid asset poverty, and 63% of African American households are in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is happening, but many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions often predate tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. The twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and for businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcome of the pandemic. Many people in our communities were already struggling. And with unemployment on a steep rise, as we just talked about, and city and state budgets that are being depleted by emergency response efforts, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. So, as we can see, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much the last couple of decades even though productivity has dramatically increased. So, according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement has dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019. So, what does that mean? Well, that means that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. So, we even have less worker protections as we have less hourly pay. So the cost of living here was already high. So let's take a look at how a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to be able to afford an average two-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. If you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average two-bedroom working a regular 8-hour day, it's fine. However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to be able to afford that bedroom, that two bedroom. So once again, that's 40 hours a day working minimum wage. And there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're actually setting up an impossible situation for low wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work in. And this problem persists all across the country. So even though costs in burgeoning tech cities like Austin, Denver, Atlanta, like we talked about, they aren't as high, but the cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone earning minimum wage. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making six figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success and marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, bus drivers, and cooks who are working long hours to maintain tech companies but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to be able to afford your apartment. But why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply. So this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA, and that stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job of meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. That's that huge bar that's on the right side of your screen. So that's affordable to people making that good salary that we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough for lower and moderate income people. And those are the bars all the way on the left side of your screen. So as you can see, housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched. And working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the edges of our region, further away from job centers and further away from supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, it's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. And because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities while people with higher incomes are coming in and staying in. So for every high income person coming into the Bay Area, a a low income person is being pushed out at about a 1-to-1 ratio. So displacement, as we've talked about, really is driven by policy choices. And we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. And the folks that are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs have been hit the hardest by the crisis. And as you can see, this starts from 2016. So we don't know the full extent of the impact the pandemic has and will have on displacement in the Bay Area and all across the country. And we can't just build our way out of um, the affordability crisis to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. But the good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community. So tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. And together we can advocate for solutions to some of the most pressing shared problems that we just talked about. And we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are dividing our community, that are driving inequity within the tech economy. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is the result of bad policy choices. The good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. So at Tech Equity Collaborative, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities a better place to live. So we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve this without the necessary policy changes. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis. And that starts with production. So, building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build homes. Preservation, making sure we're providing more resources and subsidizing and maintaining and improving existing affordable housing that we already have. Protection, we need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a long time to build the housing that we need. So in the meantime, we need to make sure that renters, tenants are protected from displacement. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, and social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially in housing. And that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing. So we have to craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. Especially now, we need to be thinking about short term and long term solutions to preservation and protection. As we've talked about, many of our neighbors are now more at risk than ever as a result of the pandemic. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. So we want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits regardless of the role people are in. So we need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse, and contracted workers. So, in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we created a standard that tech companies should implement for contracted workers, which include creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, and making sure that their workplace is safe and ensuring that there is fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip our workforce. So, training as a standalone approach will not lead us out of inequality and will not guarantee employment for most displaced workers. So, in order to solve this crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies, massive job programs, high labor standards, and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. So, at the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, and not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social construct that ensures a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. We must strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. So once again, there's tons of ways for you to get involved. We host tons of educational events. We have 2 events coming up, which I'll be talking about in more detail in a bit. If you're interested in public policy, you can check out our priority legislation that we're organizing our membership around, including the rental registry. So we'll have more information on that in the next slides. And for corporate practice, we offer a wide range of services for companies and provide ways for them to get more involved on these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So, as I mentioned, we'll be sending out a follow up email after this. So, you can reply to that follow up email. We'll connect you with our corporate partnerships manager if you're interested in that. So, this is how we work. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible to plug in while building community in the process of everything that we do. So this year, we're excited to continue our work in the housing and labor spaces through creating ethical work practices in tech, tackling algorithmic bias in housing that's further driving inequality and upholding systemic racism in the housing market, and crucial housing policies that are protecting and bringing relief to our most vulnerable communities. So you may be asking yourselves, what can you do today? Well, you can do 3 things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. So the more people that know about us, the more help we can get. And then the more we could spread our message and get folks educated and then get folks ready to engage. You can support us financially by becoming a member for $10 a month or $100 a year. or you can take action with us by supporting the rental registry or other priority legislation, which I'll be talking about next. So, the first action you can take with us is to become a community endorser of a statewide rental registry by signing our petition. So, California currently does not have a statewide rental registry, so no one really knows the scale of the rental housing crisis in California. And because we're not tracking crucial data like the number of evictions, illegal rent hikes, and violations of tenant rights, we have legislators that are making decisions not backed by data. So AB 1188, the rental registry, would collect vital data in jurisdictions across the state, allowing transparency for tenants, accountability for landlords, and help bring forth better policies that are backed by concrete data. You can also take action on various other pieces of legislation that relate to our core issues of housing and workforce and labor. So we have decided to focus our advocacy on these bills that you can see on the screen because they will do the most to ensure an affordable home for everyone, a family sustaining job, and a true safety net that's available to all Californians. So if you'd like more information on these bills, I'll be including links to each in the follow-up email so you have more information to sign on as community endorsers for these as well, and we'll have a variety of other engagement and volunteer opportunities for AB 1188 and some of this priority legislation coming up. So just keep your eye out. And finally, we have two events coming up in the next couple of weeks, which you can register for. Our first event we have is the end of single family zoning, where we'll be discussing the history of single family zoning, how it has entrenched inequity within our housing systems, and what policies we can implement to readdress exclusionary development. So that's Thursday, April 29th from 12 to 1 p.m. free. And the second event we have is Black homeownership and the racial housing divide, where we're having a conversation about the history of racial housing divide, how it impacts the broader wealth gap, and what policy solutions we can advance to create pathways for Black homeownership. And that's Thursday, May 6th, 12 to 1 p.m. So as I mentioned, both panels are coming up. They're free, they're online webinars with a similar format, but with a panel discussion, and we're inviting experts to talk about both subjects. So as I mentioned, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can become a member for $10 a month or $100 a year to support us financially, or you can take action with us, like I said, by signing on to an event, reaching out for volunteer opportunities, or becoming a member. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information to absorb. So now is the time for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A. As I mentioned, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording of the presentation slides, and everything that I talked about will also be linked on there. So keep an eye out for that. But if you all have any questions right now, feel free to drop them into the Q&A. Or if you think about a question later on in the day, you can just reply to that email that I'll be sending out, and I'll reach back out to you directly. So I'll just take a moment to see if anyone has any questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, which is great, no worries. So I just want to thank everyone for your time today. I hope you feel inspired to join our growing movement. I hope you can come out to future events or volunteer with us. Like I said, we'll be sending out a follow-up email, so keep an eye out for that and just enjoy the rest of your day, y'all. Thank you.